very good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. My name is Nicholas. I'm here with Richard Lensing, our product owner for ConnectIT. Today we're going through a ConnectIT 365 implementation training where Richard will focus mainly on the new additions of the Q3 release. A bit of housekeeping: if you have any questions, please enter them in the questions pane on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will take them and answer them after the call. We have a few other training sessions coming up this afternoon for ShipIT 365, our shipping application for Business Central, starts at 2:15, and also ApproveIT, our new solution that enables users to send out and have digitally signed documents from Business Central. So without further ado, I'd like to change the presenter to Richard, and then he'll get started.
Okay. So let's start with the ConnectIT training for today. As mentioned in the highlights, we've had the Q3 release and also a release in between waves. And while the highlights were focusing on Q3 release only, today we will also discuss the main topics that were introduced with the release 22.6.18. And we will see those in a moment in Business Central. So with that release, we made some adjustments to the import filter on subnodes. That was something that was introduced in the Q2 release, but with this release, we updated it to use a lookup page to make it easy to select the correct line to filter on. With regards to imports as well, we've added some fields, or a field actually, to the import entry to store the request URI, and this including calculated variables, and we've also introduced functions to get data from that import entry as well, including the URL or a parameter or multiple parameters from that URL. And something that we will see in a moment as well is we've added improvements in the handling of temporary values and variables in filters, both in import and export, where we can now make it more easy to create our own filter string if needed, if we have some data items that are not directly related to each other or are structured in such a way that we can't easily join them together with key fields. And lastly, we will also see some of the new functions regards to error handling or custom error handling, I should say, on some field conditions. Next up, we will discuss the new functionality included in the Q3 release, but for now, let's focus on these points first. So let's take a look at Business Central. And here, actually, well, let's start with the import. And here we can take a look at how that import filter on subnode now works. So here we have said I will maximize the lines of the definition. So here we have a definition including a possible set or array of items that includes multiple subnodes and even some subnodes that have their own sub or child nodes. And in some cases, it might be required to filter on values in the that are part of those child nodes. So before the Q2 release, it wasn't possible to filter at all on child nodes. And with the Q2 release, that was possible. However, the selection for that was a bit tricky still. So now what we've done instead, as you can see over here, is that we've added a new lookup page. And if we select that, we can see all child nodes or elements that are part of the child nodes that we can select. So in this case, we see all child elements that are part of the all attachments node or part of a child node that is below the all attachments node. And here you can also see the parent property name to see which node the element belongs to. So we have the element name and we have the node or the parent property name. So here we can see, for instance, that the external property name for most of these properties or elements is value, but that doesn't make everything really clear which node is actually selected. So here we can see what we actually are selecting. And if we simply select this, we will add it, and in this filter table, we will also link to the correct definition line. So here we can see multiple values actually. However, if we actually look at this table for a moment, if that let's take a look. It didn't really respond to the command. Yeah, here we have the page inspection. So if we take a look at those values, we also now see the filter line number as part of that filter that links to the actual line that is filtered. And you can see that despite having the same name, those filters are actually looking at different lines in the definition lines. The same, of course, can be done at the data item level. Here we can see everything below the data item, including the all attachments node that we just saw. However, it is good to know that if we use a separate data item in this structure, that we can only see all lines that are part of this node as child elements and that have the same table number. Next up, we have those the URL or URI that is part of the import entry. And if we actually go to the import entries, not sure if we have anything open here. Definitely not anything for this definition. We don't have any at the moment. Here we can now see that we have the request URI. That this was also something that was already on the export entries, but is now also included on the import entries. If we actually switch to a different environment, we should see if we go to the entries, Then we should have it over here. Oh, in this case, it's actually still blank. This was an older one. So here this URI or URL is also stored. Here you can see that we have some temporary values. Those will be calculated first, and then after the whole URI is calculated, that will be stored. This is the case for import definitions that are directly using REST, but this is also the case for response or import definitions that are used as a response to an export definition with REST. So in this way we can see what is available in the URI at all times in the import entry, and during processing we can now, for instance, also use that those new functions. So here we have the example for getURL parameter. So in this case we have the parameter idyn, and we can actually see over here that is this part, and if we try to get that value, we will get this calculated value at that moment. So what actually happens over here? Here we actually set the value that we get over here, so we can use it later on, and instead we retrieve that parameter to get the the item identifier, and then we use the function, one of the functions that was already there in getFieldValue, to get the item number back from the item table based on that value that we retrieved from the URL parameter. So this allows us, in this case, we have an example where in the request itself or the response for this import definition, we only have two fields available in the body itself, and both of those don't describe which item is used or for which item this should be imported. So in this way we can determine which item is used, and then update the correct item without having the item number as part of the body. The same can be done as well for the complete URL. So if we go back to the functions, you can see that we also have the URL value over here. This does not require any parameters because we simply retrieve that field from the import entry that is used during processing. And then we also have another function that's called the getImportEntryBody. This might only be used in a couple of cases, but this allows you to actually get the content stored as a base 64 string for the import body. So in this case, actually, we could say, let's take a look actually how we would use that. So for instance, let's take a look here. Yeah, oh, that was a bit too quick. So let's use that function. Once again, this doesn't have any parameters in this function, because we simply retrieve the content of the import entry, or specifically from the body field. In this case, we will get a base64 string. So if we want anything readable, then we can use the function from base64. Now this has some optional values for the text encoding and the code page. In this case, we can leave those blank to use the default UTF-8. And in this case, we could also set that as a node to the current record that we are importing. And there we can actually give a description and use one of the new parameters for this function as well, skip if empty. We could leave that blank. In that case, if we leave it blank, it will always add the node regardless of if there is anything in the node or in the import body in this case. This could be a way to, for instance, store the import itself, the content of the import as a node to the current record. In this case, we've used the item vendor, so that's not really a useful one to add a node to, but you could use this, for instance, for a sales document where we also can see the nodes in the fact boxes. Next up, let's go to the export. And here we have here we have prepared an export where we use the filters with temporary values. So let's take a look at what we have here in the definition. So here we have on the top the item category, but below that, on the same level, both the item and the item variant. Even though the item variant doesn't really have a direct link to the item category. But in this case, we only want to output the item variant as a subnode of the item category. So what we could do is get all items or all item numbers that have this item category code assigned to it, and create a filter from all those items, and after that use that filter string as a temporary value that we will see over here. That's used as this filter list as a filter here. Previously, we would have set it up something like this. So we had to specify all variables as separate separate temporary values, and use that pipe sign, for instance, to create that string. However, that didn't allow for a variable number of values. And now we have the string that will be calculated first, and after that we will check for the filters. So what do we actually have over here? And maybe it's good to see the output for this first. And for that, I will turn on the output for the item and also for the filter item list, because this is ultimately the variable that we will use, or the temporary value. So this is the value that will be used as the filter string. So let's take a look if we do create example exports, what we have over here. So here we can see that we have the item category, we have the items. This is in this scenario would be something that's that would have no will be left out of the output normally. And after that, we should have the item variants. In this case, we probably don't have any item variants for this selection of items. But what you can actually see over here is that we see that for each item that belongs to this item category, we can see the item filter. And we can see that it only adds to the filter. And afterwards, we have the filter item list where we have used a function del character to make sure that we don't have that first pipe sign. And this is actually the value that's used for the string. So let's actually take a look in one other environment where we should have a similar definition. In this case, we don't have anything belonging to this. Let's just make sure that we get one file. So we enable the array and do a proper export. So here we can see we have a lot of categories without any items that contain item variants, but we should have. Yeah, there we have it. Here we have actual data for the item variants. So let's focus on one of these. This should be the item category. So let's just make sure that we get this one. And once again, let's check the item and the filter. And let's do this again. And apparently that was the wrong one. Yeah, that's actually the wrong fields that I've used for this. So let's make sure. You know what? Let's just go back and use the proper exports. And now we should also see the actual item list. So in this case, for instance, we have this group or category that contains 2 items, and here we can actually see that those items have a variance as well. So this filter was actually used to retrieve those. And then next up, we have some error handling using functions. So here we have a simple definition. If we currently use the create example export, that shouldn't give an error. That just gives us output. However, in this definition, we have used some functions. So for instance, if we check the name, we have the function errorIf, where we have set, in this case, a check value, and that's left blank to give an error if the field is blank or the value is blank, and give back an error code and error message. These 2 are optional. We do have a standard error message that is also included. But if you include this, of course, this can be helpful to identify where the problem occurred. So if we look at the address, we have a similar setup. Also, if the address is blank, then we will give an error code and message. In this case, it's the 02, and previously we saw the 01. And here for the country region code, we currently actually have the error if not and error if both enabled. So in this case, this should give an error back if the country code isn't US, and it should give an error back if the country is NL. In this case, this will never trigger, of course, since if it's NL, this error message will already give us back an error. So let's actually change this. Currently, I'm using an export in the client itself, so we will also get the error, of course, back in the client. However, if we use this during processing in the background, of course, this will give the error back in the background process. But here you can actually see that we get back the code, the message that we set as part of the parameters, and we also get the standard error message as part of this, where we can actually see, okay, this was the field value, this was the value that it was checked against, and this is, here we can see if we've used the error if or the error if not. So if the conditions should met or should not be met. And in this case, we can see that the field value is US. We checked that it should generate an error if it is not a null, so we get the error back. This could, of course, also be useful if we use imports where we want to validate data. And with that, I mean not the technical validation. If it's allowed to write something to a field, but we might also want to check against certain values that are technically allowed, but should return an error if those are not okay values to accept. One of those examples is actually something that we could see in the handling of one of the OAuth2 tokens. Actually, I should be able to check that over here. Oh, that actually should still be this one. Yeah, this is the one, and right now I could set it up. And let's actually validate against this. Okay, great. So what we can do over here, for example, in this response or this input definition that's used for the response, we will get back if the response was valid. So let's actually take a look at the log for this. We see that we get a token back, but we see also that the response is valid. We could check for this in the import as well, if this isn't valid, or if the value here isn't yes, then we know that there is an issue, even though I know for certain that this response won't actually trigger an HTTP error. It still would return a 200, so an HTTP okay. However, in the response itself is an error. So what we could do here is go to this. And then use the error if not. So in this case, I've set up an error. If the value is not yes, we will get this error. For now, well, actually, let's leave it like this and just change some of the values for the request. Let's actually go to where the data is retrieved, and that's this part. And we are using actually the username over here. So if we set that incorrectly, this should return an error. Well, in this case, actually, well, that's a shame. We actually get a forbidden error, so that makes sense. So in this case, we actually get an HTTP error. However, if that would still return an HTTP 200 error, then we would have a successful export. And in that case, we would have an incorrect import due to the content giving back an error based on that function. So let's actually change this then. And of course, also change this back to make sure that we have the correct credentials. That's a bit too much. That should be it. And let's try again. So in this case, we have a successful export. However, we still get an error message back because we now validated against the value needing to be no instead of yes, and that's not the case according to our error function. So that's with regards to the release for 22.6.18. And now if we look at the Q3 release, we've added some processing rules or made some adjustments to the processing rules that I can show you on the export definition and partly on the import definition as well. We now use or can use flow filters in our filters, which allows us to get different results for flow fields as well, where we will see an example, I believe, based on the item inventory, based on location filters. And we have the ability now to skip empty XML documents, and that's related to the output conditions on the root element, where we can set it up in such a way that we have conditions whether or not a data item should be visible in the output. And we saw this partly, or we saw the request and response, but not actually how it's used for the OAuth2 custom grant type, which now allows for custom request and response definitions using the import and export definitions. And related to that, and that's something that I can also show you, we have a new function as well, because for some web services, the token is expected as part of the message instead of in the headers. So let's get back to the client. And let's take a look actually at those processing rules first. So now we've added a processing delay that we can set up separately for each definition. And this will allow us to make sure that we only export data, or we actually create the message containing all the data after this time has passed. So in this example, we've used the sales shipment header where we monitor insertions. So basically, when we post a sales shipment, for instance, from a sales order, then we will create the sales shipment. However, during that creation, the sales shipment header is created, and after that, the sales shipment lines are created. If we monitor the insertion on the sales shipment header, we don't know for certain if the transaction is completed for creating that sales shipment line. In most cases, that shouldn't be an issue. However, in some cases, it might be that the export is not always or is actually checking right at the moment that the sales shipment header was inserted. So there is a chance, even though it's a slim chance for most of the time, but there is a chance that we are missing data during our creation of the export entry. To make sure that we don't do this, or in this example, we can use a processing delay. And what this does is that it checks the export queue entries against the current time and this processing delay in milliseconds. So in that case, we will still use the table monitor in the same way that we've always used it. So once the sales shipment header is created, it will be inserted into the export queue. But there we have the time of creation in that export queue. And only if this time has passed, then we will process the queue entry to make an export entry. And this assures that we know for certain, okay, there's no way that in this case we have 60 seconds there's no way that the sales shipment header should be, or the sales shipment isn't completely created by that time. So we know for certain by the time we will actually start with creating the export entry, and more importantly, get all the data from the tables, that we have that transaction is completed. Of course, it can also have its other uses as well. Or for instance, if you have some basic data that is created or updated that needs to be synchronized, for instance, what you typically would see in administration is that somebody is, for instance, creating a customer or updating a customer, and that might trigger an export based on some fields that are changed. But that could also trigger multiple exports or in that case, and with this option you can also limit the amount of times that export is actually triggered, because we will then check against the creation time. So I'm not sure if there still is a queue entry. There isn't in this case. Let's then take a look if we actually have a sales order to process. That doesn't contain any, that does contain something. And we have a quantity to show, good. So if we start posting this, in this case, I want to ship it. Okay, great. And then go back to the queue. We'll now see that since we monitor inserts on the sales shipment header, that we now see a record in the queue, and we can see that it was created in this minute. So if we run the job queue for exports, or the job queue entry for the processing exports, the earliest time that this will be processed is 60 seconds after this was created, because of that processing delay configuration on the definition. Not actually sure if we have the job queue running at the moment. No, that's on hold. So in this case, it wouldn't even get processed, of course, but this will make sure that we have some time before this will actually get picked up by the job queue entry. Now, one thing that is good to know is that if we use the manual processing here, that will not check that setting, and that's a deliberate choice. Because this won't check at all if how the configuration for that is set up, if there is a schedule at all. The only thing this actually checks is if the definition itself is active, and if there isn't a job queue entry already running that should automatically pick this record up. So of course, if we now process it, we can simply create the entry regardless of whether or not that 60 seconds was already passed. In that same section, we have the maximum number of retry attempts. So in the Q2 release, well, I should do this. We've added this processing rule in the setup, in the ConnectIT setup. However, that was one setting that was used for all definitions of both import and export. Now we have changed it in such a way that this is the default. So if we create new definitions, we will automatically get this default value. So if that's left 0, then that will simply remain 0. However, that can be set up with another value as well. So here, if we really want, we could set this up with a different value. I would suggest not setting this too high. This is mostly used to make sure that if we run into some sort of locking, that we can still easily continue the process without any interference for users. So that no actual action is required at that moment, and we can still continue the process. However, if we need 10 attempts to actually successfully process an export or import, then that's really telling something about that there is actually an underlying issue that we need to take a look at. Or there might be an issue that's just consistent because of the data, maybe because we use those functions for the error handling, or in this case, we actually have an FTP server that is not available, or maybe even with the incorrect credentials as well. So after a certain point, we know for certain that that error is still remaining. But this will be used for the actual processing in the import and export entries. We will take a look not at what we did earlier with the Q2 release, is check the ConnectIT setup, but right now that isn't checked anymore. That's only used as a default value, same as for logging, and instead we check the value, the maximum value against the definition. And in the import and export entry itself, we also count how many tries, how many attempts we already used, and then compare that against the maximum number that's set up in the definition. Of course, you can still leave this at 0. Then we will simply not retry the definition if it fails. Then we have that the conditions against the XML document or empty XML document. So here we have set up a definition. In this case, we don't have any output conditions set up over here. So this will always, if there is one vendor record at the very least, this will always return some form of output. However, what we actually do over here, if we take a look, we have set up purchase headers. So what have we done here? We check against purchase orders with an amount greater than 0. And what we actually set up over here, that are related to that vendor number. And what we do then is get the amount from the order. And then we add that to the total amount. That's something that we clear before we start processing orders, and add that to the total amount for that vendor. And then at the end, we return the vendor amount on the level of the vendor. So in this case, we get the vendor and all open purchase orders with some form of amount. And what we of course could do, so this would always create output. And in this case, we can also say that we only want that if the variable vendor amount is greater than 0. That way we only get vendors back where we have an actual open amount on purchase orders. Previously, this condition was not checked. on the root level, so on all other lines this was checked, however not on the root line, and now it is checked so that we only get the output that we actually want or can make sure that we actually ignore certain records if the conditions are not met. So let's take a look what this actually does. And here we can see, if we take a look at the vendors that are included over here, are all vendors that have a vendor total amount that's greater than 0. Then next up, we have the authentication with OAuth2. So to be clear, this isn't actually proper OAuth2. What we support with this. So previously we already added a custom grant type, which allowed you to set up a custom request, but that's still dependent on the response being in the format that we would expect, or a simple format only containing one node and no subnodes. However, sometimes we do see that we have customers or partners that are struggling with authorization on web services, where we do need to refresh a token or get a new token. However, either the request or the response or both are not conform to the OAuth2 specification. So right now, what we do support additionally to those options are simply defining your definitions yourself. So we have an expert definition over here, and that we already saw a minute ago, and the response definition. And instead of actually taking a look at which property or which element is used, we use temporary values that we can retrieve. So in this case, I have an OAuth2 authorization that only contains a token that we can actually use. We could set it up in such a way that we also check for the time that the token expires or the lifetime of the token. But we also have some cases where that simply is not available. So in that case, we can set our time in seconds ourselves. If I were to clear this, and then you can see that we actually can set either the expires in or expires at, where this is in seconds or this is an actual date time. However, in this case, I will just set the token expires in at 1 hour or 3,800 seconds. One thing that I do need to actually make sure that we don't forget is we still have that error over here. And of course, I don't want to run this part in error, so we can leave the check, but we want to set it up in such a way that it doesn't fail. Let's go back here. And now, if it's set up properly, we will get the token, and that's using the this expert definition to send the request. And that also contains the URL and all headers that are required. And we end up using the response over here with this import definition, where we check for this value, temporary value. So let's check the actual outgoing request. So here we can see that we have the URL, we have set the method as we would normally, we've added this as a REST method. In this case, we can actually leave this blank because we don't check the response on the expert definition itself, but instead we check it from the OAuth2 side. And then we have the The body available in this case, it's the simple one. It's based on the OAuth2 authorization with a filter on that code as well. That isn't required, but we do need one record as a base for this definition. So this is just an easy way to do it, but you could also set it up on a setup table, for instance, or on the company info table. Just make sure that you get one record back so that we can build up the message. So this is sent to this URL, and then we should get back a response, of course, and we have set it up that we use this definition to process the response. So in this case, we have these fields. We do actually, in this case, have a valid until field. However, in this example, that's actually not giving back the date time in a format that's easily used. But once again, there are some examples, for instance, this one, where we don't actually get back on time at all. Instead, we only know that on the server side for that web service, those tokens are set to a lifetime or a time to live of 1 hour. And we know in this case also that the token time to live or expiry date time is in 1 hour. So what is required over here is, if we take a look at this token, we have used the setTemp file to set it up to store that in the temporary value. And this is also the value that we check in the OAuth2 record. Here, this is the same one. And we can actually see that it now contains a value. So that value is stored as we would normally do as the bearer token. And from that point onward, we can use that and also automatically refresh, of course, because that's the main purpose of this, to make sure that we can send out requests using that OAuth2 structure, and in this case with custom requests and responses. Actually, in this case, using actually XML, and where we would normally use JSON for most cases, but we can use the same logic to automatically refresh if the token has expired to process this. And additionally, this is also one of those examples where we need to provide that token as part of the message. So here we have that function get OAuth token, which set to the OAuth2 record code, timewax in this case, to retrieve that token as well. That's only available for custom grant types, to make sure that we don't just give out the bearer tokens for actual authorization code or client credentials grants, because there should be no need for those to be used in any other way than the authorization header. And the last part that I want to take a look at are our use of flow filters right now, or our support of flow filters, I should say. So here we have an export on the items, and we actually use a location filter over here. And we also use a flow field that is dependent on that location filter as well. So what we do, we have a simple filter on the item number, and we want to make sure that we only get the quantity on purchase order that's bigger than 0. However, we also want to make sure that we only check location blue, in this case, for our exports. So the quantity on purchase order, which is calculated using the location filter, should only give us back quantity on purchase orders with location blue. And then we also have another output condition over here. That's something that we can also take a look at, but that's not necessary for the flow filter itself. Let's actually take a look at what we get back if we use it like this. So here we only get one item back, and that's because we have a quantity on purchase order that is bigger than 0. However, if we change this, for instance, to something like red, then we actually don't have anything to export. Let's actually see if we do all locations. Yeah, then we can actually see that we have the multiple items as well. And I believe we should have a location that's exclusive to some other items as well. That's apparently not it. I could have, of course, also check these. So this is just a filter as we would use normally. And here we actually have some data. And here we can see that we actually have a different set of items altogether. We don't have our original item in here anymore. And we can actually, let's check if I haven't saved that. So let's actually check that against the not using the flow filter at all. And then we can see not only do we have back this item, but we should have some other values as well. In this case, mostly on the sales order side and probably on the inventory side. We can see that we have different quantities based on that filter as well. So not only is the flow filter used to make sure that that the flow fields in the filters also check for the flow filter, but also the output in the message itself, of course, is also different based on the flow filter. And that is it for this training session. I don't know if there are any questions so far.
Thanks, Richard. We have one coming in, but it was near the beginning of the session after about 10 minutes.
Okay.
So I hope you can put it into context. Isn't it easier to show the parent node instead of only the column value? That was a question.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Isn't it easier to show the parent node instead of only the column value?
That's probably based on the import filters on subnodes, I believe. But we actually do show that. However, we only show that in the lookup page and not in the filter page itself. However, that filter page is also used for other processes. So if we go back to that, and actually check this one. There we have it. So I believe this is in response to this page, where here we don't actually see the parent node as well, which might be an improvement in the future as well. However, when we look it up, we do show it over here. And of course, in the application logic, we do actually check the correct node as well.
Thanks, Richard. That was the only question I saw being submitted.
Okay.
So we've gone a bit over time already. So I want to thank the attendees for joining. Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, no problem.
And we'll be in touch. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.